Oxford University Press Higher Education Webinars. And now, Oxford is proud to present Sam Sommers, Situations Matter, Social Psychology in Everyday Life.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon or morning to everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Sam Sommers. I'm a social psychologist at Tufts University outside of Boston in Medford, Massachusetts. What I thought I would do is sort of in the spirit of my title here, social psychology and everyday life. I thought I would start with a story, which is something that I often do in the course of teaching social psychology as well. So I thought I would just jump right in and start things off this afternoon that way. So to set the scene here for our introduction, it's 8:15 in the morning. And that puts me right behind the wheel at the tail end of my morning routine of getting two daughters out the door and dropped off at school. So bear in mind, to this point, it has taken feats of great strength, patience, and endurance to even get this far, to drag brushes through tangles of hair and to get the right shoes on the right feet, to make sure that all pairs of underwear and tights have been put on facing forward, right side out, and under the aforementioned shoes. And that's, just to get myself dressed. I still have to get the kids ready, too, at this point. But now we're in the car, and there's really only one obstacle remaining on our morning objective of getting to school, and that's the rotary, which, perhaps you know it better as the traffic circle or a roundabout, or perhaps if you're also 3 years old, the round and round. And on that morning, as we sat in line waiting to go into the rotary, into the round and round, we did what we usually did, my daughters and I. We counted down the number of cars in front of us. This morning, though, our countdown stalled out at 3, and a voice from the back seat asked, "Daddy, why did we stop?" And I explained, "Well, I'm not sure, honey, but the red car in front of our line isn't moving right now." That happens sometimes at the rotary, and so I gave the red Nissan 3 cars in front of us the benefit of the doubt for a reasonable amount of time, to get his affairs in order before he would take matters into his own hands and lead the troops into battle. About 8 seconds, I think, to be fair, because I think 8 seconds is a reasonable amount of time to allow someone to wait for an opening before they, again, have to move forward and keep things turning in the morning traffic. Now, it's true that, at least where I live, we all see these signs that say state law, drivers yield to rotary traffic. But we also know there's a little bit of wiggle room in there, and that these warnings are to be taken about as literally as warnings about mattress tags and key duplications and the like. And so I was not the only one to start honking. I mean, I may have been the first one, but I was not the only one. Quite quickly, however, there's a cacophony of car horns going on behind us, and another, again, comment from the back seat of my car, "What's all that noise, Dad?" And I explained, "Well, honey, people are honking because the guy here in the red car in our line needs to learn how to drive." And her response, of course, is, "You mean he didn't go to preschool when he was little?" My response to her was, "Well, his dad probably drove too slowly to get him there on time, sweetheart." And so finally, after 2 minutes that felt more like 20, we inch forward again. We go into the rotary. My daughter asked me another question, but to be totally honest, I didn't hear it the first time. I was still fairly agitated by red Nissan's impotence in the rotary in the morning commute. "Daddy, you didn't answer my question," she says. And I say, "I'm sorry, honey." Ask me again, "Why did all the cars coming out of the round and round have flags on them?" I said, "Nothing. All the cars coming out of the round and round had little blue flags, and their lights are on, but it's not nighttime." I believe my response was something along the lines of, sort of slumped down in my seat and explained, "Well, honey, that's called a funeral procession. You have to wait patiently and respectfully to let those go by." There's a moral to my story here, a moral that transcends the twofold conclusions that I am apparently an impatient driver and an even lousier role model for my children. And the moral to the story is about the power of context and the ways in which ordinary situations in which we find ourselves have a dramatic influence on the way we think, the way we behave, the kind of people that we are. But nonetheless, we often fail to notice that influence of context. It remains sort of hidden in plain sight, right in front of us, right in front of our faces, sort of like the impatient driver at the rotary who doesn't notice the full extent of the surroundings in which he finds himself during the morning commute. And the moral of the story in teaching social psychology for me is one of trying to draw the students' attention to the ways in which context has this dramatic influence on our instincts, on our preferences, on our behavioral tendencies, but again, in ways that we're not regularly aware of. And to me, the reason I start with a story and the reason that I try to incorporate both the mundane and the sublime aspects of daily life into my teaching of social psychology is that to me is what makes the field so fascinating. It's the scientific study of everyday life. In fact, I actually just published a book that adopts this very approach, trying to use personal anecdote and pop culture analysis and analysis of current events and humor and so on to review basic social psychological research on how situational forces shape perception, cognition, behavior, and so on. It's very much written as a general audience book, but also works accessible and, for that matter, low-price complement to more classic textbooks or readers for intro-level social courses. But what I thought I would do, because I'm talking today to people who are colleagues who also teach Introduction to Psychology, Social Psychology, and the like, is not to give you the standard book talk or book spiel, but rather to focus in a little bit more on my area of research and some of the new directions in which I'm pursuing in my research lab and how it ties into that, what I would identify as the major theme of social psychology, again, this power of situations. Again, the book, as I alluded to before, talks about your traditional areas of the field of social psychology, the classic research findings in areas like social perception, attribution theory, how we make sense of the world around us and other people's behavior, helping behavior, bystander intervention, the bystander effect, and so on, social influence in terms of conformity, compliance, obedience to authority, self-perception, the self-concept and its malleability, our tendencies towards self-deception at times and how we think about and evaluate ourselves, gender difference, and the notion that while certainly there are obvious biological, physiological differences between the sexes, that a lot of what we interpret as or ascribe to being entrenched and immutable and evolutionarily dictated sex differences are in reality very surprisingly context dependent in a variety of interesting ways. Attraction and close relationships, intergroup relationships, and prejudice more generally. This last area, again, as I mentioned, I don't want to give you the standard book talk here. I was going to focus in on some of my research that really isn't highlighted in the same level of detail in that book. I'm going to talk about my research, which falls most directly in this last category of intergroup relations, on questions of stereotyping and prejudice, how diversity of a group, its composition, its heterogeneity affects the way people think and communicate, interact with one another, and so forth. And then tie that all back into this broad brush theme of the power of context and the ways in which social psychology speaks to our experiences in daily life. So we live in I would argue, a particularly interesting time to study intergroup relations. And in particular, my focus is often on interracial relations. And I say that because, well, I'm sure at any era in American history, since I predominantly study these issues in the U.S., but at any era in a nation's history, there's certainly idiosyncratic aspects of what's going on culturally or socially. But we live in an interesting era in which we still see pretty consistent and robust racial disparities on a wide range of important services and outcome measures, but at the same time, very interesting variability in people's attitudes with regard to race and their beliefs about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate and so on. And so I thought I would start with what's actually a very straightforward study. It's some survey data, actually. These are data that I collected with a colleague at Harvard Business School, Mike Norton, and what he and I did, as I put sort of the critical graph up on the screen here, is we conducted a survey with over 400 Americans, a community sample, over 200 white Americans, over 200 African Americans, and what we did was we simply asked them to estimate the pervasiveness of racial bias in the United States over the decades. So specifically, we asked them to think about each of the following decades you see up on the graph here: the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the double zeros, the aughts, if you will. And we asked them two questions for each of those decades. At least I'm reporting here their answers to two questions for each of those decades. Number one, the question of, at this point in time in that decade, how problematic was anti-black racism, anti-black racial bias in the United States. And number two, how problematic was anti-white racism or bias against white Americans during that decade. And first, it's worth pointing out some of the interesting parallels or convergences here. And what you see, for example, if you look at those, the two lines, the solid lines at the top that are declining and have a negative slope there, what you're seeing, the darker bar, that's black respondents' responses, and the grayer bar, that's our white responses. And you'll see that there's agreement that over time, over the decades, anti-black prejudice, anti-black bias has declined in the United States. Now, there's some divergence of opinion with white Americans thinking that decline has been even steeper than black Americans, but there's a general consistency to that pattern there. But there are also, of course, some really interesting divergences. To me, I think one of, if not the most interesting one, is what happens when you look right at the most recent decade, as close to current day as we get in this data set. And what you see there, if you look at the two gray bars, the solid gray bar and the dotted gray bar, you see that when you get to the 2000s, they've actually crossed over. In other words, in this sample of 200 plus, over 200 white community members, white Americans, what we see here is that the average response for, the average rating for anti-white bias is actually even greater than the average rating for anti-black bias. In other words, the average response of our white participants in this survey is to suggest that they think bias against white Americans has actually superseded and passed bias against African Americans as a significant problem in this country. I think a noteworthy finding, admittedly just a descriptive set of data here, can't really speak to process and unpack exactly what's driving this effect, but it is an interesting finding, I think, in light of a variety of contemporary debates regarding issues like affirmative action and race-conscious policies more generally. This is sort of where we seem to be situated right now as a society, that there is this interesting divergence between, certainly in these data, how white and black Americans view race relations. Of course, that's not an either-or dichotomy when it comes to race. This study only looks at white and African Americans and doesn't consider Latino perspectives and Asian perspectives and a variety of other important questions. But just as a slice to set of data to set the context for what I was going to talk about here today, this is, I think, one of the many respects in which we live in a society which is very interesting to think about the science of intergroup relations and how that plays out in our day-to-day lives. Now, again, these are survey data. In my research, what we often do is examine what happens during the course of actual intergroup relations, during actual interracial interaction, and how preconceived notions and assumptions about race, how those shape what goes on in the course of actual interactions, in the course of actual communications. So one set of studies I wanted to tell you a little bit about is work that I have done with, again, Mike Norton, who's at Harvard Business School, and Evan Applebaum, a former graduate student who's now at MIT. And what we and colleagues have done is examined how individuals behave or interact differently in racially diverse versus racially homogeneous dyads. Specifically, we've had them engage in, I guess, what you would conceptually refer to as a photo identification paradigm, though the other way to think about it is if you have kids or are a fan of children's games from your own childhood or for other reasons, you may be familiar with the game Guess Who. That's basically what we had our participants do in our research in this line of investigation. We gave them a series of photographs. You see an example of the stimuli set right in front of you here. And your task in this study is to look at a photo array like this and ask as few yes or no questions as you possibly can to figure out which of these photos from this photo array is the singular target photo being held by your partner across the table from you. And so we have sessions of this study that look something like this. One individual seated in front of the array of photographs and another individual on the other side of that table and holding in her photo book, in this case, one of the photos from that array. And I know the resolution on these photos isn't great, but you can make out here is that there are a wide range. There's a wide range of dimensions here that vary, right? You could ask a variety of questions here about facial hair and facial expression and clothing and headwear and so on and so forth. There are specifically 3 very good questions to ask if your goal is to slice in half, exactly 50%, the number of available photos that could be a plausible candidate. You could ask whether the individual is on a red or a blue background, though. You have to ask a yes-no question. So you can ask, is it a blue background? That would, regardless of the answer at the first stage, cut the number of photos in half. Asking about gender would do the same. We have 50% men, 50% women here. Asking about race, ethnicity would also do the same. 50% individuals who pre-testing identified as being individuals who others tend to see as white, individuals who others tend to see as African American. So background color, gender, race are all questions that if you ask about, you cut this photo array in half. These are effective, efficient questions to ask in trying to accomplish your goal of identifying the target photo as quickly as you can. So we ran a variety of versions of this study, different variations, looking at different questions. For one thing, one question just at a straightforward, very simple two-group comparison was, well, how do, for example, white individuals in this study engage differently, perform differently, communicate differently when their partner is another white person versus when their partner is from an out-group? Specifically, when we have an interracial dyad versus a same racial dyad, how does performance in this task differ? And what we find looks like this. So if you look simply at the number of trials in which the participant who's in front of the photo array asks about race, uses race as a question in trying to come to the correct target response or target photo identification, you'll see that when paired with a white partner, close to 100% of our white participants ask about race. When paired with a black partner, that number drops down to closer to 60%. They ask about gender, regardless of who their partner is. They ask about background color, regardless of who their partner is. But depending on who they're paired with, our white students become much more likely, or frankly, become much less likely to ask about race, just from strictly a purely demographic descriptive standpoint in trying to identify the target photo. What, pray tell, are they doing if they're not talking about ethnicity in a study like this, given that these are smart individuals who are playing a children's game and certainly capable of completing it in an effective manner? Well, here's an example just of one participant, a white individual, a white respondent, paired with a black Confederate playing this game. Here's one set of questions this individual asked in trying to identify the target photo. Is it a woman? Is the background blue? Two of the first questions you would expect to certainly hear. Brown eyes, wearing earrings, bushy eyebrows, dimples, are teeth visible? And at this point, the individual was able to identify the correct photo from the 32 photo array. And so what you see time and again in this study is individuals navigating this ambiguous situation in a way that allows them to not talk about race, to not ask about race, and specifically our white respondents. This is how they perform when they're in this task. In looking at these tendencies with other groups of individuals, with African American respondents, for example, you see they ask about race right off the bat. It's one of the first three questions as you would think. This is an effect of finding that we've found many times in the lab, and we've started to refer to as indicative of strategic colorblindness. This sort of effort to avoid doing anything wrong or problematic, or to avoid even the hint of impropriety or prejudice by claiming or acting as if you don't even notice race in the first place. I think this is one of the interesting findings in studying race and race relations in contemporary America. What we find time and again is that I think for most white Americans, the best outcome they can foresee in talking about race would be the absence of a negative outcome. That's sort of the highlight. That's the best thing that can happen, is to avoid saying something bad, or to avoid getting in trouble, or to avoid making a bad impression. And so when given the choice, they will often avoid that issue altogether so as to not even go down that road. We argue that this is a strategic form of colorblindness and not a legitimate colorblindness in which people really don't take in difference. Our arguments for that, well, there are a variety of ways to support that argument that we've made. The first would be that we know from functional magnetic resonance imaging, from fMRI studies, that individuals pick up on the change in racial group membership of a set of stimuli, of a set of photos, within 150 milliseconds. I mean, we notice race, just like we notice gender and other demographics, very quickly, almost automatically. Number two, we found that there are individual differences that predict this tendency, that this tendency to avoid asking about race, or to go out of one's way to avoid even acknowledging racial difference in studies like these, are predicted by people who score high on an extrinsic motivation to avoid prejudice scale. So there are different reasons why an individual might be motivated to avoid prejudice. There's a more internal, value-laden idea that it's important to my sense of who I am and my own sense of virtue and morality to be colorblind, to not be influenced by race and how I interact with people. There's also a more extrinsic motivation, a more externally motivated desire to avoid sanction and to avoid getting in trouble and saying the wrong thing and suffering the social consequences of that. And it's that latter set of motivations, this more external motivation to avoid prejudice, that seems to predict this tendency towards colorblindness. Another reason we argue it's a strategic effort in these interactions in interracial settings is that the normative precedent established by one's partner in these contexts is incredibly powerful in determining how someone will behave. This is probably not that surprising, right? In an ambiguous situation, we turn to those around us to guide what's appropriate behavior. And so, for example, in a variation of the study where you as the participant are paired with a Confederate, and as opposed to being the person who's seated behind the photo array and asking all the questions, first, you're the other person. You're the individual who's given a series of target photos in the little photo album. Your job is to simply answer questions yes or no, and your partner, the Confederate, is actually playing the game, asking the questions. And one version of the study, we have the Confederate behave the way that our race-acknowledged participants did in the original study. They ask about race as one of the first or second questions each trial, which is a reasonable thing to do given the setup of the photo array. In the other condition, our Confederates have been instructed to play the game, so to speak, in a colorblind fashion, to never ask about race at all, to never mention race in the 4 trials that they play. They then switch roles. And when it's time for the participant to be the person who asks questions, well, not surprisingly, they turn to the performance, the precedent-setting performance of their partner to guide how they're going to behave. Here you see how individuals, white participants who are paired with a white partner, engage in the task. When their partner has asked about race, you'll see close to 90% of the white respondents will also ask about race when their turn comes up. When their partner does not ask about race, fewer than 50% of the participants will do so when it's their turn to go. But you see that this pattern is particularly strong when your partner is African American. I mean, it's close to 100% of our respondents will ask about race when the partner has done so, and when the African American partner has played the game in a colorblind fashion, about 10% of our participants will then ask about race when it's their turn. 90% will play the game in a colorblind fashion as well. So clearly, again, this susceptibility to normative influence and the precedent established by the other individuals in the pair strikes us as support for this argument that this is something strategic that's going on here, as opposed to any sort of legitimate ability to not notice race and to block race out altogether. I think perhaps the most interesting finding in this set of research is what happens when we look at the nonverbal behavior among our participants. So we video record these sessions, and we then show silent videos of these sessions to naive coders, raters, judges who know nothing about the study, and we simply ask them to assess the person that they see on the screen in front of them. So knowing nothing about the study, knowing nothing about who their partner is or what they're asking about or not asking about, we show these nonverbal slices of behavior to naive judges and ask them to evaluate the people that they see. And what we find is that individuals who avoid asking about race with their partner in the study, they are rated as being as making a more negative impression nonverbally. They're rated as less friendly from a nonverbal perspective by naive judges. So again, while the motivation may be I'm going to avoid a negative consequence here by not asking about race in this interaction, ironically, counterintuitively, or maybe counterproductively, those white individuals who avoid asking about race are actually judged by at least naive individuals who watch them as being less engaged and as being less friendly from a nonverbal standpoint. We also have interesting data that suggests that what's going on here is at least in part mediated by and explained by cognitive depletion and the idea of self-regulatory capacity. And so we give our participants after these interactions a Stroop color naming task. And I know many, if not most of you, will be familiar with the idea here that you're supposed to read the color in which these words are printed, not the word themselves, and of course that requires some sort of suppression of the automatic tendency to want to read what's written on the screen. This is a hard task for anyone to do. It's particularly a hard task for our participants who have earlier spent the entire interaction trying to avoid talking about race. The more people avoid race during the first part of this interaction, the greater the Stroop interference score they demonstrate later, and that is indeed a variable or an outcome measure that mediates the relationship between avoiding race and nonverbal friendliness. We've actually also done some studies along these lines with children. One study in which we looked at 8- and 9-year-olds, sort of a younger group of participants, and 10 and 11-year-olds as an older group of participants. It was a mostly white sample recruited from local schools in Boston. And what we did in terms of the task we assigned them was we varied whether they were asked to engage in a race-relevant or a race-neutral task. Specifically, it's the same task, the same Guess Who photo array task that I talked about earlier with the adults, but we had one version in which race is relevant. 50% of the photos are of white individuals and 50% are of black individuals. And another version where it's race neutral. So every individual in the task is white. I guess you could argue maybe it's not race neutral so much as it's totally racially homogeneous, but race is neutral in terms of being any sort of distinctive variable that could help identify the target photo. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen there's a colored splotch, a splotch of color, which was included in there to give those photos that had no racial variability at least another perceptual dimension that varied that people could presumably ask about to make the two versions of the task more comparable. And so what we find in having children engage in this task is something that looks like this. So again, the y-axis here of a total number of questions that are asked in order to get the right answer. And given that your task here in this interaction is to ask as few questions as possible, the higher your score on this y-axis, the worse your performance is, the less effective or efficient you're being in identifying the target photo. And when we have our kids engage in a race-neutral version of this task, what you'll see is that, as you would expect, the 8 and 9-year-olds are a little bit less efficient. It takes them about a question more to get the right answer than the 10 and 11-year-olds. This makes perfect sense, given that the older children are somewhat more advanced when it comes to categorization and problem solving and logical thinking and so forth. What's really interesting is when we inject race into the scenario, you'll see that the performance of the younger children does not change, but what happens is the older children are suddenly the least effective performers, at least effective with regard to identifying the target photo quickly. They are more effective if the goal is to avoid talking about race altogether, which some of them in the debriefing alluded or even explicitly stated as having been one of their objectives. It seems from this and other research in the area that looks at these social developmental tendencies that, well, we certainly know children at various ages start to acquire the skills to categorize objects, to categorize people, and to use that in their day-to-day reasoning. What we're finding in the study is that at around this age break of 9 or 10 years old, the majority of our participants, our children participants, are also then acquiring the knowledge about societal norms regarding when you aren't or are not supposed to admit that you use such categories, or at least which categories you are or are not supposed to admit to actually using. Where this comes from, I think, and again, to allude to mundane experiences that many of us have had, when you grow up in this society that we live in now, and children at the grocery store say to their mom something like, "Oh, look, Mom, that man over there has a brown face," or something along those lines. There are various ways to respond to that. There is, "Well, yes, he does, and you have sort of a peach face," or "Yes, he does, and people have different skin color, different hair color, different eye color." But when our response is a sort of a modal response, our instinctual response is to shush that child and make a quick getaway to the frozen aisle as if the child has insulted someone or pointed out a toupee or something along those lines, the message becomes, well, not even so implicit, but the message is clearly conveyed that there are some categories we talk about and some categories that we're not supposed to talk about. And I think that the data here with the children speak interestingly to the implications of that as it plays out with people navigating their day-to-day social interactions as well. So I think an interesting set of processes, at least in my mind, implicated with our general tendency in society to be moving towards this colorblind ideal. What I want to end with is take a bit of a step back and think in more general terms about the notion of diversity and group composition, and return again in the end of my time here with you this afternoon to this explicit focus on context that I started us off with. So to talk a little bit about diversity and the effects of diversity, I think an interesting conclusion to emerge from a review of this literature is that when you think about or you look at the effects of diversity, it's clearly a mixed bag. It is not, well, diversity is certainly a buzzword that university administrators and corporate executives and politicians all give lip service to in a variety of ways and sometimes actually substantively work towards. It's an interestingly mixed bag with regard to what we know about diversity and its effects on people's outcomes. You know that even just from looking at the data I just presented to you, where in our diverse pairs, individuals are completing that task in a less efficient manner. the positive effects of diversity tend to be observed in research studies when it comes to outcomes like problem solving, flexibility, and creativity. Now, here I'm actually referring to diversity in general terms, broadly construed, diversity of experience and skill set and age and race and ethnicity and down the line. When you see positive effects in the literature of diversity, it tends to be when in the domains of performance. The more negative effects for diversity often include drops in morale, increases in anxiety or negative affect, cognitive depletion of the sort that I talked about before, with individuals exerting more of their executive capacity, trying to not say certain things, and therefore leaving diverse settings more depleted, their resources depleted than they would be otherwise. And so, how do we reconcile these different perspectives? How do we reconcile both the potential positive impact of diversity, which I think many people believe in, university administrators, and for that matter, the Fortune 500 and the military and others who file briefs on behalf of universities who go to court to uphold their race-conscious admissions policies, saying diversity is important to us not for moral reasons but for performance reasons. How do we reconcile that set of beliefs and findings with the idea that there are also certainly bumps in the road when it comes to day-to-day interracial interaction and how we function within diverse settings? Well, again, I would argue that one of the factors that we certainly need to pay close attention to is that of context. And so the last study that I'll present some data for here today will be one that looks at interracial interaction and context, and specifically manipulates the context or the framing of an interracial interaction and sees how that plays out when it comes to the communication styles and the performance cognitively and otherwise of the individuals involved. So in this study, we manipulated the racial composition of dyads, again, in this case, racially diverse, and again, in this instance, white and African American respondents, as well as all white dyads. Now, there are many questions, again, that one could and should ask about this design. Why not all black dyads? And that's a great question for both external validity, but really more for theoretical reasons as well. That's an incredibly important question, and one that we weren't able to get at with this participant sample, so one that we're trying to work through still at this point. But and again, generalizing beyond that white-black dichotomy is obviously an incredibly important future direction as well. In this study, at least here's our setup: racially diverse dyads and all white dyads. And what we did was then we had our individuals, our dyads, engage in a series of problem-solving tasks. And what we varied here was every pair was given the same set of problem-solving tasks to work through, but we manipulated the focus of that task, the way we framed that task and where we directed their focus as they headed into it. So in one condition, we highlighted, we emphasized performance. We told them that you were going to be asked to do a series of problem-solving tasks together, and there are correct answers to these problems. There's a gold standard or correct answers for these problems. We want you to focus on getting the right answers, and in fact, we're going to offer financial rewards for the pairs that perform the best, that have the most right answers and have the highest score at the end of the study. In another version of the experiment, same exact set of tasks, but we framed them as icebreakers. We told our participants that what we're interested in is how you work with other people. You're going to work through a series of icebreaker tasks, and afterwards we're going to ask you questions about your experiences. So they get the same exact set of tasks, but again, they're framed more as icebreaker, get-to-know-you tasks in which social issues and making a good impression are really the paramount goals. And a control condition where we tell them nothing. We just give them these problem-solving tasks and see what their natural tendencies are. So this is work that I've done with Laura Babbitt, who's a current PhD student here with me at Tufts. And what we find in the study, I'll give you a couple of the graphs here. So one outcome measure is simply how in sync the pairs appear to be as they're working. And so again, we take videotapes of their performance, we show them to naive coders who don't know anything about the purpose of the study, and we ask them to assess how in sync the two individuals seem to be when they work as a pair. And what you'll see is that whereas in the control and in the social condition, our all-white dyads are rated as being more in sync than our interracial dyads, in the task-focused condition, where their focus is not on making a good impression, but rather on getting the right answers and on performance, you'll see that effect. If anything, it flips. The two bars there are not significantly different from one another, but the interaction there is significant, such that there's no longer this disadvantage for the interracial dyads in terms of how in sync they seem to be. And if anything, that effect has flipped around. It's this interesting set of findings that runs through this experiment that suggests that, ironically, when focused on the social components of the interaction, that's when we often see some of these social costs in interracial settings. And again, this idea of focusing on making a good impression or perhaps on avoiding saying the wrong thing and making a bad impression doesn't seem to make quite as good an impression or lead to quite as socially satisfying and efficient an interaction as does focusing on a higher order task goal or performance goal. We also gave our participants, like we did in that previous study that I had presented to you, a Stroop interference, or Stroop task, where we can measure Stroop interference scores. And here you're going to see responses for our black participants in the interracial dyads, the white participants in those interracial dyads, as well as the white participants in the all-white dyads. And if you look at the control, and in particular in the social focus condition, what you'll see is that the two darker sets of bars, the black participants in the darkest bar and the white participants in the interracial dyads in that medium-scaled bar, they are depleted. They're showing higher interference score on the Stroop test than do our white participants in all-white dyads. That difference has been talked about and found by some other researchers and other studies in the interracial interaction literature. The typical explanation that's offered is that white and black individuals in interracial settings bring to those interactions similar, well, different types of, but similarly valence concerns about the interaction. For many white individuals in the interracial interaction, the concern is about, again, making a good impression or not saying something wrong and not coming off as biased. For African Americans in interracial interactions, the concerns are often trying to figure out where this other person is coming from. What does she or he think about me? Where is this person racially biased or treating me differently because of my background? You'll see that when you get to the task focus condition, those depletion effects are not there anymore. Both the black and the white participants in this study, when focused on the task itself, being in a diverse group doesn't have that kind of mentally depleting, cognitively depleting effect on them. They focus on performing well in the task, and interestingly and ironically, they seem to socially enjoy it and make a better impression on one another as well. So I think a pretty straightforward demonstration here of just how important context and framing becomes when we're talking about something like intergroup relations and interracial interaction specifically. So to wrap things up, the argument I would offer today, and the one that I try to use as the unifying theme for my social psychology course, is that context matters across a dramatically wide range of domains, from the mundane to the sublime aspects of our daily lives, from the really positive side of the human experience continuum, things like attraction and pro-social behavior, to the darker side, I guess, if you will, of human behavior, the obedience, blind obedience to authority and prejudice and aggression and so forth. Again, my goal in teaching my social psychology course, and to me the exciting part of teaching and researching social psychology, is that opportunity to explore that influence, that role that context plays in a scientific way and as it relates to everyday experiences and interactions. So again, with a focus on research studies and on data certainly foremost, but also current events and popular media depictions of human nature, personal experiences. I have my students keep a journal in which every week they write about something that happened to them, but then analyze that event in terms of the social psychological concepts we've been discussing to that point in the semester. It's just one of the many ways in which I try to get them to apply what it is that we're talking about in the abstract and in a research parlance to their day-to-day existence, to their everyday lives. So that's what I have prepared for you here this afternoon. Thanks for listening.
As a leader in higher education, Oxford University Press is committed to broadening the ways in which faculty can share and discuss cutting-edge research in the discipline. Our Psych Talks and Cultural Psych Talks seminars showcase the authority, innovation, and excellence in the discipline. If you or someone you know would be a good candidate to lead a session, please reach out to us at jane.potter@oup.com. Bookmark our webinar site to view a schedule of our upcoming live webinars. Browse by session and sign up right on the site. To provide feedback on today's session, please visit the following link and fill out a short survey. You will automatically be entered in a chance to win $50 in OUP books from our Academic and Trade Division. Your feedback will also help us to refine our presentations going forward. And lastly, you can always visit our website to see Oxford's growing array of psychology titles. Thanks for visiting, and we hope to be able to connect with you again soon.